I'm endlessly fascinated and curious about the world around us, about business, about politics, about the arts, about culture, developments, social issues, and the people. Most importantly, about the people that are shaping our future. Every night, I get the opportunity to have conversations, to dive into conversations with thought leaders, with change makers, entrepreneurs, politicians, and everyday heroes who unpack the ideas and stories that I think matter to all of us. What's the future of our economy? What's the future of our country? How do we build stronger communities? What can we learn from music, theater, sports, politics, the arts? How does policy shape our real lives? What does leadership look like, real leadership in today's environment? If it's interesting and relevant and topical and we're talking about it, you'll hear about it here at 6 o'clock on the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. I want to have real conversations, in-depth conversations. These are ideas we're sharing. This is the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. Thanks for joining me. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour. I've got Richard Lyall back with us today. Richard is the president of ResCon, which is the Residential Construction Council of Ontario. And Richard came out with a really shocking series of announcements this week and some projections of what was going to happen to the housing business, what has happened and what will happen to the housing business in the Greater Toronto Area and in Ontario that I think needs to be talked about. It needs to be talked about, at all levels. And I think governments have got to take some action real quick. Richard Lyall, welcome to the show.
Good to be here, Brian. Thanks.
So what was this announcement that I'm thinking is so shocking?
Well, we had a couple of things this week, but the first thing was on Monday, we released a report that we worked with the Missing Middle Initiative and the University of Ottawa on, which was a ranking, a scorecard for municipalities in Ontario. And because people understand things like report cards and letter grades and things like that. And of course, the housing issue is very complicated. How we got to where we are and how we're going to get out of this. Although getting out of it's a little more simple, but we'll come to that. But the reason why we did this was that it became clear to us that people just didn't really realize what was happening and how severe the problem is with housing. And that's because a lot of the data that was being relied on was older data, like older starts data. And so they weren't really getting a clear picture of where things are now and where they're going. To put it, and we're talking about sales and starts data. We can get into that a little bit if you like. But the problem is that there was a bit of a little cognitive dissonance going on here because on the street, I'm talking to contractors and builders and what's happening with the workforce and laying people off in big numbers, and not just skilled trades crews, but also project teams in the back of house project teams, the ones who put everything together and manage it. Meanwhile, we still had people trying to interview me about labor shortages, and we had people still bragging about how many tower cranes we have in the sky and stuff like that. And I was saying, hey, as they come down, they're not going back up again. And so, and then you also have things like the Housing Accelerator Fund and the provincial government, both federal and provincial government, running around handing out checks to municipalities based on their so-called or supposed performance relative to delivering the amount of housing relative to some of the targets that have been set, right? We know those targets, Ontario 1.5 million, at the federal level, much bigger numbers than that. And we thought some of that was really quite bizarre because, the performance really wasn't there in our view. So we did this report, and of course, it came out. We looked at 34 municipalities. There's a whole methodology for how they were graded in the back of the report. That was the University of Ottawa again, and the Missing Middle Initiative. And out of the 34, 22 got a failing grade, an F. Two got A's, two got B's, and three got C's. and then that was it, right? So, but the Fs, the 22 Fs, was really quite, as you said, shocking. And but really not when you think about something like this. Like if compared to Alberta, we have we're building about a third of the housing on a per capita basis that Alberta is building right now. And that's why we had later in the week, we had our fifth annual housing summit that we set up to track these things. And like that report, we're going to keep that report coming every quarter because we're going to track where we're at, right?
Sorry, I
Relative
apologize.
to production.
Did you say that we are building one third on a per capita basis of new starts versus what Alberta is doing? One third?
That's correct. Yeah.
So the whole province is failing.
Yeah. Yeah. No, in fact, but if you extrapolate this, you can say that the province is failing and the federal government's failing because they all have their fingers in the pie. Having said that, all levels of government have done certain things that are positive. They're sort of acknowledging and have been that we have a serious crisis here. The federal government have their Build Canada Homes. Ontario most recently had Bill 17, which is for some very significant changes to development charges and how they're managed. And then at the municipal level, you've had various efforts by some municipalities to really improve their systems. You had, Mayor Parrish in Mississauga came up with a really nice housing plan. Kudos to her, and reduced their development charges.
But
And
is it having
say,
an impact?
yeah,
You know, the numbers that you talked about, and let me just quote from your announcement if I could.
yeah,
The findings were troubling and should set off the alarm bells for policymakers across all three levels of government, ResCon President Richard Lyall said in a news release. Overall housing starts were down 40% in the 34 municipalities studied, with condo apartments leading the decline down 54%. Things were even more stark in the city of Toronto, where housing starts were down 58%. And then this is the most astounding statistic. Condo apartment starts were down a staggering 80% in Toronto, falling from an average of nearly 8,000 during the first 6 months of the previous 4 years to just 1,606 so far in 2025. You're saying that we are 67% behind the housing target set for the provincial government.
that's right. That's what we meant. That's when we realized that we needed this report to bring this to light because people were believing their own, I'll use the word narratives, too much, right? It's a serious problem. And then, Brian, just think about this number. Sales on high rise are down 91%, and sales in low rise are down 70%. This is for new housing. So, uh, you're a businessman, you know where that's going eventually. That's going to be a 90% drop and a 70% drop, respectively. And then if you connect that, think about all the economic activity around that and all the jobs. We were, sitting back and saying, wow, this announcement just came out on this steel plant that's closing down. It's 200 jobs. And we're thinking, that's nothing compared to what's happening in our sector.
You say that in
Um,
this announcement that ResCon says the slower pace of construction likely meant 10,209 fewer construction jobs in the city, part of a wider loss of an estimated 24,195 jobs across the entire Greater Golden Horseshoe area. This is a this is not a recession. This is a depression in the housing industry, is it not?
yep, yep. Well, words are important, right, Brian? And we've called this a crisis for some time. And a crisis, by definition, is something that requires urgent action. And but we're going to a catastrophe now. It's beyond that. And you know the crazy thing is a big chunk of this is fixable. It's within our control. It's quite different from the last big correction that we had in the early 90s. And so that's where I'm feeling, somewhat positive about what we can do with this. That's if, on the proviso that the various levels of government get their acts together. I'm writing something comparing, for example, Ontario and Alberta right now, looking at the various data points from the two provinces, and it's you've got that housing comparison. I mentioned that they're building, 3 times more housing on a per capita basis than we are. They're on fire. They can't build fast enough. But it's a very interesting story. And, they have average higher per capita incomes. They've got a higher per capita GDP in Alberta. A lot of the other economic data points sort of line up. And then you get to housing. And in Alberta, the average price of a home is just over 500,000. And in Ontario, it's over 800,000. And you ask yourself, why does that difference exist? In that totality, because that's a huge number. And of course, the reason is that in Ontario, unlike any other jurisdiction in North America outside of Vancouver, no one taxes new housing, the way it's taxed in Ontario. And I can't think of a jurisdiction outside of Vancouver, again, that has the amount of red tape that we still have. Some efforts have been made to change that, but we've got a long way to go. But those are things that can be changed. And a down payment today for a young family and so on in Ontario is just the increase in two taxes in the last 10 years. Now, the federal government on taxes, there have been some changes on rental housing, and we saw a boost in rental housing there, where the sales taxes on rental housing and DCs were lowered. The federal government in the spring went ahead with a 5% reduction effective May 27th on sales tax for first-time home buyers. The province was supposed to follow suit and then did not. And there was opposition to that. And some people were saying within the industry that, it's first-time home buyers. It's not enough. It's got to go further because only 5% of the market is first-time home buyers, which of course is nonsense. And the first-time home buyer market's about a third of the market. In fact, the last numbers I saw were 39%. And so, the province did not go ahead with that. But on the other hand, and said that, that would be a bit of a hit to the provincial coffers too, as well. But then what happened was the premier said, well, look, if the federal government goes further and cancels all sales taxes, then the province will follow suit on that, which is a bit odd. But so, anyways, we're in this sort of limbo on the sales taxes. And again, we still have other fees and levies that have gone up dramatically, like land transfer taxes. So when that report that we did before on the 36% of the cost of new housing is taxes, fees, and levies, that's very real. And and people can't afford it. They don't have that in Alberta. And then on the red tape, Alberta, the government there, the minister, when he spoke at our housing summit, uh, brilliant, brilliant guy. The government of Alberta recognizes housing supply as the number one priority. So he said, for example, when it comes to green building, if we can afford it, we'll do some of these things, but they're just going to stay at tier one green building relative to the national code and not go beyond that because the priority is producing decent housing for people. And, when it comes to how green we are, I think what was our VP of Building Science and Innovation told me the other day, we're 9% ahead of the Paris Accord on how green we build. We're leaders in that already. And this sort of this blind pursuit of what people think is what they call net zero, they don't even really understand it, is crazy. And it's just driven up costs to the point where, you could be talking about another $50,000, $60,000, $70,000 per condominium with the next phase that they're looking at. And thankfully, Ontario didn't follow suit on that. So, at the edges, we've got some positive things happening. Then there's the stress test and the immigration debacle. Now we need, the stress test was designed, that needs to be fixed. It was designed to reduce consumption. We don't have that problem now. And then the immigration, what happened with immigration was crazy. And we do need foreign investment. We need investment in housing. In fact, generally, Brian, as you know, we need investment, period, because we've had a flight of capital from Ontario recently. So these things can all be fixed. What we can't fix is Donald Trump and turf wars right now. But, those are extenuating circumstances.
And Richard, people are starting to vote with their feet. I understand that Ontario last year and so far this year has suffered out-migration from Ontario, and Alberta is growing its population. So people are moving from
Yeah,
Ontario to Alberta. And
absolutely. I mean,
young
you know what's
people that are
happening?
our future.
Yeah. Oh, look, there are two elements to that. One is we've had people that have come here, and guess what? This isn't the better place to be. It's been very difficult. You've had immigrants coming here, and because of the cost of housing, principally, they're working three jobs and whatever, and they can't make it work. Then we've got our young, best and brightest, a third of whom and we're talking serious talent here. We are a talent factory. This is not a problem of the people, right? As we know. But, like in STEM graduates, science, technology, engineering, math, we've got brilliant young people and they're leaving. And the ones that are leaving are really the ones we can't afford to lose because they're the risk takers. But they're the ones who are saying, look, I did everything right. I did everything you asked me to do. But I start working. I can't afford a decent place on my own. And let's remember that only about 30% of young people are getting help from their parents on housing of one form or another. So that leaves 70% that aren't. And those 70%, they're hungry and they don't want to work hand to mouth in downtown Toronto with the where housing costs were. And so, yeah, they're
And the,
leaving.
and the people that
And guess
are
what?
living
Life is
in
better elsewhere.
the people that are staying are living in very small condominiums. They're
Yep.
delaying family formation. Or if they buy a house that's 45 minutes an hour or farther outside of the city, and they're not spending any time with their family. So we're harming our social fabric going
Yes.
forward in the future.
Yes.
We're going to take a break for some messages. I'm going to come back in 2 minutes with Richard Lyall and talk about how we got here. And before we go back to talking about the solutions, I think it's going to be really important to ask Richard, what's going to happen if we don't make changes? Because I think that this catastrophe could get a lot worse, and then it could end up having a bubble, and that boom bust bubble situation creates an even worse kind of situation long term. Stay with us, everyone. Back in 2 minutes. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio. I've got Richard Lyall, the president of the Residential Construction. What's the organization called, sir?
It's the Residential Construction Council of Ontario.
And who do you represent?
Well, we like to think of ourselves, and it's, consistent with our membership, is builders. We are a building community. Think of some of the big name players in our world, Madame Tridel, Tribute, Great Golf, Green Park, and so on. They're members of our council, and we focus on really construction related issues. Anything to do with building a building. We're not really kind of on the land side of things or marketing of housing or whatever. It's really construction related activities, although we have kind of gotten more involved in other issues as it's become apparent that there were significant problems that were not being properly addressed, right?
And you represent
Like some of
both high rise as well as low rise. Is that correct?
That's correct. And we build all the social housing too. I mean, it's, our industry's involved in everything, any form of housing and some light commercial with that. And of course, we have an infrastructure group too, because you need infrastructure to support new housing.
You actually came out with another report on that this week, or a comment on that as well, which is well worth talking about. But let's come back to this announcement that you came out with earlier in the week. And let me quote from it again, if I could. Across our 34 municipalities, pre-construction sales of condo apartments are down 89%.
That's correct.
88%. And pre-construction ground-oriented sales, which is, I presume, single-family homes, townhomes, things like that, are down 70%. So the people
Yes,
that have said that it's only the condo market that's being impacted are not right. It's also clearly all building down 70%.
all building.
This is a clear indication that Ontario's housing situation will get worse before it gets better, and that the market weakness is not isolated to the condo market. The numbers come on the heels of another CMHC report released earlier this month, which suggested Toronto was the epicenter of weakness for residential construction in the first half of the year. The report warned that Toronto was on pace for the lowest annual housing starts total in 30 years. In 30
That's right.
years, we've doubled our population in 30 years, and yet we're going to have the lowest housing starts. Richard, how did we get in this terrible situation?
Nobody was paying attention at the 30,000 foot level, Brian. That was the problem. And accountability was divided between different levels of government. So you had this sort of chicken and egg game going on various issues. I'll do this if those guys do that. It's like what Premier Ford is saying just this past week that, you know what, that tax break for the first time home buyer isn't good enough, doesn't go far enough. We want more, but we'll do it if the federal government does it, right? Well, the federal government already acted on the first time home buyer bit. They did what they said they were going to do. So why would the federal government right now double down and go further, especially when, if you think about this is an Ontario problem. And Vancouver, that's it. Outside of that, I mean, you look at Alberta, they can't build fast enough. The prairie provinces are fine. Quebec has some record starts happening there and rental housing and so on. Eastern Canada is doing, they're doing fine. They get a healthy market. I'm not saying that they don't have their respective challenges and so on. Even the housing minister from Alberta will say, we have a housing crisis, but it's nothing like Ontario. And so, here we are. And then the word is out that there's going to be a break on the sales taxes, but then it's not happening. So, guess what happens? To the extent that you have a market there, like first time home buyers or others, well, some of them are going to wait and see, wait for this thing to come. I mean, why would you jump into a market if you're going to get a big break on sales taxes on something of this scale, right? So, it's just, at the 30,000 foot level, it just wasn't there. They weren't looking at the numbers properly. They were doing crazy things like when, Minister Miller at the federal level, remember when they doubled immigration federally without any regard to housing supply or healthcare services for that matter, right? Crazy things like that did not make any sense because our immigration was already very high. And then you look at, the college debacle in Ontario where we had this feeding frenzy on foreign students, and then that imploded. So right now, yeah, one of the things we said well over a year ago is that the population numbers are dropping in Toronto and Mississauga. At least Mayor Parrish in Mississauga saw this and acted, and she's doing real things and real changes that are helpful. Is it enough? Well, sometimes it takes a while to turn a super tanker around. It's not exactly
But sir, I want to challenge you if I could. In
yeah.
February of 2022, February 8th of 2022, that's
Yeah.
3.5 years ago. Doug Ford, the Premier of Ontario, released the Ontario Housing Affordability Task Force. He came out with 55 different recommendations on how to improve housing affordability. And he was quoted as saying they're aimed at making house prices more affordable by dramatically boosting the supply of housing. Let me repeat that.
Yeah.
By dramatically boosting the supply of housing. February 8th, 2022. You're quoted at this time in responding to it. So to say that we haven't been paying attention, I think is wrong. We've been paying attention. We just haven't done anything.
Well, okay, you are absolutely correct on that, and I stand corrected. Sorry for the misunderstanding there. We are aware of these things, and like good Canadians, the rhetoric is thick, right? But you know what we're not good at? Implementation. And but my hat's off to you on that one. That is a very important distinction there. So on that housing task force report, 2 years later, only 17 of the recommendations were implemented, right? And so people were kind of saying, well, what was the point of that? You know? And that's the problem that we have. Canadians are, I think we maybe invented the committee in Canada or something. Like we're just very good at,
Richard,
yeah, go ahead.
how did we get to this situation? Like, during the 2010s, how did we get to this situation?
Well, again, it was kind of death by a thousand cuts. It was insidious. It was kind of a slow, cancerous growth that it just got worse and worse and worse. And then combining that with, we had high immigration, we had people that wanted to come here. They were bringing money. They were prepared to pay those higher prices. And so the prices went up. We had the economics of scarcity at play. So demand was not being met with supply. And so that trajectory just went up and up and up until, and we knew we're headed for a cliff until we knew it was going to end. And we were saying to people, this is going to be over someday. But some people thought, for example, that, condominium construction square foot cost or prices would go to, or the price of a condo would go to like $2,000 a square foot. We had not long ago, new projects being priced out at $1,500, $1,600, $1,700 a square foot. You look at what they're selling for now. It's half that, right?
I met a
Um,
an expert in sales of pre-construction condos last week who said that during
uh,
sort of the 2010s, at least that last half of the 2010s, so 2015 to 2021 or two, he said we were selling the math. We weren't selling living spaces. We weren't selling homes
no,
because the vast majority of the buyers were investors that thought they were going to
yep,
be able to buy and flip it before they even had to come in and close on the purchase of the house. And so therefore it was an investment vehicle that we were selling, the math, he called it, rather than actually a place to live. And that's what caused the problem in his mind. And then he said that, and then government saw this golden goose and wanted to tax it out of existence. And they did. What do you think about that?
yep, 100% correct. I mean, it got to the point, Brian, where a condo would be sold, or someone would buy a condo or five or 10 with no intention of ever taking possession and closing on it. They were going to flip it, right? And it's called an assignment. So you have this assignment. And there was actually got at the point where there was a company that was created, and you probably know some of these people too, but to trade assignments. So you could throw it in an assignment market. It became like that famous book, Mass Popular Delusions and the Madness of Crowds, which was a famous book written in 1846 on market bubbles. This was a classic bubble. And then the size of the units, I think a lot of people, they didn't care what the size was. It was just an investment vehicle. When people talk about the financialization of housing, we turned to my mind, we turned housing into an investment play on a large scale, and that was the financialization of housing. So people weren't really paying attention to, it's 400 square feet. In fact, some of them who may have been from other parts of the world where they measure things in meters probably thought it was a bigger unit. But and then why these boxes? Well, there was a huge demand for housing. There was a market for it, and there still is a market for small little condos, little pied a terre or whatever that you want to have in the city. But our technical standards, our restrictions in our codes and so on, actually encouraged smaller units. So we have a restriction, for example, on how big a floor plate on an apartment building or a condominium building can be. There's no reason for it. There's no research behind that, but it's there. And then when you add in elevator shafts and stairwells, and you're trying to maximize the amount of units you have relative to the size of that floor plate, it's hard to fit in 2 and 3 bedroom units. And of course, the way costs were going, the 2 and 3 bedroom costs were getting prohibitive. And it's a market. So the market will go where markets go. And people forget too that our industry, we've got hundreds of significant home builders and thousands of contractors. It's a fiercely competitive industry, one of the last truly competitive industries out there. And then you had the land situation, which was choked by this growth plan that was ridiculous, introduced 20 years ago, along with a green belt that became this sort of sacrosanct, never to be touched again land. When in fact, there's a lot of land on the green belt that is not farmland. It's not, conservation land, and it could be built on. It's had things on it. The greenbelt land only accounts for 1% of our agricultural produce that we consume, too, as well. But yet we did that. We took this huge piece of land and said, thou shalt never go there again. And by the way, we're anti-sprawl, but then they didn't do anything to allow for higher densities. And all that created was this ex-urban sprawl issue where people were still driving to qualify. And why were they doing that? Well, it's behavioral psychology. If you grew up in a house with a backyard and you have a family, that's what you want. And that's what you're going to look for. And most people will not, Herbert Simon had that word satisficing. They're not, you're not going to compromise on that. Most people. And if you can't get that and you really, really want to have a family, you're going to leave. Right. Or if you want to have a future where you're not being crushed by the cost of housing.
So
It's a government created problem.
government created a problem. And so,
Yep.
Richard, if we don't make changes, if the governments don't make changes, what's going to be the situation in a year or two? Take us out. You've talked about significant job loss already. Are those job losses going to continue?
I ran some numbers on this on my own. I used to be an analyst a long, long time ago, and I came up with numbers that were well in excess of 100,000 jobs. And depending how far this goes, we could be talking 200,000 jobs in Ontario, right? And we could be talking 1.5 to 2.5, a hit of 1.5 to 2.5% of GDP. And those are huge numbers. But if you look at, 70% down on low rise, 90% down on high rise, that's eventually going to result in a 90% drop in construction activity, a 70% drop in construction activity, all things considered that goes into that. And just think about how many people work in the industry, and they're massive numbers. So
does it suggest that some of your members are going to go bankrupt? Is there going to be financial distress within the building industry?
Oh, 100%. Companies that there are some groups that saw this coming and throttled back. But as you know, when you get into a bubble, you get people that start really piling on at the end, right? Because of course, it's just going to keep going up and up and up. I mean, part of the problem we had was a lot of people that are working in the industry and buying into the market have only known real estate values to climb, except for, remember, 2008, 9, we had a 6-month blip there. And then in 2017, we had a 6-month blip in the market where it dropped quite suddenly with interest rate moves and stuff like that. So they've only known the market to go up. But that was the investment play that was created because, wow, you can make really good money here. And if it's your personal residence, there's no capital gains tax. There's no, it's just cash, right? So off we went there. And, that party's over.
These
And the
workers,
investors, yeah.
these workers, are they going to hang around waiting until the market comes back? Or are they going to move to Calgary?
So there are two things that happen there. We know this from the last time. They'll find because people have to put bread on the table, and it's heartbreaking what's happening right now because we're laying off and firing really good people, and not through any fault of their own. So you're going to do two things. They'll try to get a job in another industry somewhere, somehow, or they're going to leave. And in this case, manufacturing's down too. So in the past, we'd have sometimes people go into manufacturing or whatever. That happened in the early 90s. Or, they're going to leave, and they will leave. And Alberta and, other parts where you have much less expensive housing and you have jobs, they're going to go. Why not?
So if the people leave and housing starts for a year or two or three or down dramatically, what happens in like 2028, 2029, does it not lead to like another boom? So we got this boom historically, this bust currently, and we're going to have another boom in the future that, we just on this roller coaster ride?
Yeah, so my theory, that's a great question. And, guess what? I mean, this is still one of the best pieces of real estate on the planet. People want to be here. We have resources galore. We've got fresh water. We've got we've got stable government, all this stuff. So when the worm turns in 2 or 3 years, demand is going to shoot up. The cost of housing is going to go through the roof again, right? And we're not going to have the capacity. We're not going to be able to supply housing on scale that will be required. And that's where, for example, we're looking at offsite construction right now, factory built housing, because we can see this coming, and we're not going to have that workforce. And if who knows what's going to happen with immigration? We've had that decades long problem with, skilled trades immigration and challenges there. And I'm not sure. I just don't really have a lot of confidence when it comes to the government and immigration. Still, so yeah, 2028 to 2030 is going to be really interesting. And that's if we can get it right today. I've seen forecasts that put us getting back to the average in 2035, the average
2035
amount of
before things.
production where we were.
We're going to take a
Yeah.
break for some messages and come back in 2 minutes with Richard Lyall, the president of ResCon, the Residential Construction Council of Ontario, about what we should do. Because we've talked about how bad it's got. We've talked about that not a lot's been being done, even though we've been talking about it for 5 years, or for certainly 2.5 years since the Housing Affordability Task Force. And we've talked about how migration is happening, how layoffs are happening, how construction is down in condos and in single family homes and townhomes, etc. What's going to happen is that it's going to get far worse, and so we've got to take some action, and so therefore we got to figure out exactly what Richard thinks we should do. We're going to take a break. Be back in 2 minutes with an action plan. Stay with us, everyone. Back in 2. Welcome back, everyone, to the Brian Crombie Radio Hour.
Yeah.
We're chatting with Richard Lyall. He's the president of ResCon. He's been a strategist within the construction business for quite a long period of time. ResCon is the Residential Construction Council of Ontario. He's come out with a major report this week that talked about how I think you said it was 22 of 34 or something like that municipalities that had a failing grade in the Greater Toronto area and the Southern Ontario area. He talked about how residential construction is down dramatically, particularly in condos, but also in surface built housing. We talked about how pricing has come down. We've talked about how layoffs are occurring. He's worried about bankruptcy within the housing business. We've talked about how we've been talking about this for a long time, and we haven't taken action. And he's mentioned that taxes have increased dramatically and red tape has increased dramatically. So I got to ask you, sir, if you sat down with the premier or with the federal minister of housing, what would you tell them they got to do?
Well, the first thing that they have to do is really come up with an aligned plan between different levels of government. There needs to be alignment here, and we still don't have that yet. I mean, we've got some, as I mentioned before, some positive things happening, but not on the scale that's needed to turn this around. And let's keep one thing in mind, that the province has the ultimate authority over this. The federal government certainly has a huge role, but the federal government is federal, and that housing crisis is not the same across the country. So to ask the federal government to do things just for Ontario is difficult, right? And then at the provincial level, well, there's no place in the Constitution for municipalities in the Canadian Constitution. Municipalities are creatures of the province. So if these municipalities are getting an F grade or a D, we get a bunch of Ds in there, 3 Ds, and so on, then the province has the power to fix whatever the problem is, right? And because municipalities, that's why they call them bylaws. They municipalities can pass laws by the leave of the province, right? And so that needs to happen. And we need to, it's one of the things that, we've been fighting over these green building standards. We're not anti-green building, but we had all these municipalities going off hither and yon, creating their own, in response to their own particular climate change crisis, their own green building standards, and they didn't know what they were doing. I think we finally got that fixed now with Bill 17. But we still have litigation pending with the city of Toronto over this. So just a segue there. So the levels of government need to get together, and the targets have to be rooted in an actual plan. If you're talking about 1.5 million homes, that's great. Now, what's the plan to get there? We don't have that yet. And the federal government had their own plans, and we've got municipalities, City of Toronto with their housing plans and whatever with targets that are never hit. They keep kicking the can down the road, repackaging things, for example, and then announcing a new strategy, which is just a reworked old strategy. So we have to get serious about this stuff. And then, there are certain things that must be implemented. We can't keep taxing housing like alcohol and cigarettes. We tax housing like it's something that we want to reduce public consumption because it's not good for you. Right? That makes no sense at all. And that's a the federal government, for example, and kudos to Prime Minister Carney and Minister Robertson for the getting rid of the sales tax for first-time home buyers. Now, we'd like it to go further than that, but they did that. They passed it and they put it in place. And then it just sort of nothing happened at the provincial level, as we've talked about before. But at least they did that, and there was a recognition for that. Now, we'd like it to be right across the board, and certainly a new formula has to be created to pay for infrastructure related to growth. We can't keep putting that on the backs of first-time home buyers and first-time renters, which is what happened. There was a perversion that happened here. The fact that young people, the whole failure to launch thing and why they're leaving the province is because the boomers and Gen X just dumped, effectively, unwittingly, dumped these huge costs on the first-time home buyers and renters. And those costs went up 1,000%, 2,000%, depending on which time period, you looked at. I mean, within a 10-year time period in the city of Toronto, for example, a two-bedroom condo went from $8,000 DC cost per unit to $88,000.
1,000%
Now, on
increase.
what? Yeah, thousand. And so tell me, and when you had no real income growth during that same period of time, Brian. Real income growth adjusted for inflation. I know you know what that is, and I hope the listeners do too. But on what planet does that make any sense at all? And then turn around and blame them. Oh, they're lazy. They're not leaving home. They got to work as hard as we do. I heard a radio show, and I commented on it. Or on the radio show, it said, I think it was Jerry Agar, and I love Jerry Agar. And Jerry Agar said, they got to work as hard as we did when I was young and save up for a house. Well, Jerry, the circumstances, the game has changed. The rules have changed. Yeah, we're still playing Monopoly, but the cost of those houses has gone up 10 times, exponentially. So it's not the same game. You're just
Do
going
you
to jail.
do you think that the people in charge are hearing you?
I think so now. And one of the problems, I think, they're hearing us. We've got people, we got their attention, but now it's cutting through the Gordian knot, the morass of competing interests. It's the not wanting to jump in first. For example, the federal government made a mistake on the development charges part of things, where they said they'll make municipalities whole if they, cut their development charges. Well, the province isn't going to jump in right after that and say, "Oh no, we got this." I'll pick up the tab. So you get that stall there, and so it's we're waiting for things like that to happen. And then you get problems where the federal government did say, hey, we're going to cut the sales tax for first time home buyers. That's great. But then the ball gets dropped at the provincial level, and we've had people in the industry saying, "Oh, don't do that. It's not enough. We want the whole enchilada." Well, no kidding. Yeah, we'd love to get the whole enchilada, but there's two things, Brian, that that governments are not good at, and a lot of people don't realize this. The governments are not good at cutting taxes once they've been created, and they're not good at fixing their own failed organizations. They're very good at creating new ones, because when you fix a failed organization, that usually means you got to lose some people. You got to fire some people potentially, and you got to make some serious changes. And it takes a lot of work to get in there.
And
And so
they're going to vote against you.
they're going to vote against you. You're going to make people angry. Remember our buddy Tim Hudak there, when he announced that he was going to
Cut the civil
reduce
service.
the size. Yeah. And guess what? 1 out of 4 Canadians gets a paycheck directly or indirectly from the government. So that didn't go over well, right?
Richard Lyall, this has been a very helpful conversation. It was an excellent report you came out with this week. I think that this is a wake-up call. Thank you very much for your contribution to this issue. I really appreciate it.
Thank you, Brian. Thanks for your interest, as always, and great questions.
We're going to take a break. And when we come back, I'm going to give you my 10-point plan on how to solve this problem. Stay with us, everyone. Back in 2 minutes. Thanks, Richard.